Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Accompliceship Now, Disability and Indigeneity on the Frontlines of the Climate Crisis with our honored guest, Jen Deerinwater, Deerinwater, and moderated by Marina Tsaplina, Tsaplina. I am Marian Kurici, Quirici, Faculty Advisor of Duke Disability Alliance, the student organization hosting this event. This event features live captioning by AI media, as well as American Sign Language interpretation by communication access partners. To view the captions, please click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window and select Show Subtitle. Our speakers will make every effort to provide verbal descriptions of any visual material they may share, and to identify themselves by name as they speak in turn. If you experience any access issues during the event, please send a message to Eli Meyerhoff or Hadia Madni in the chat. This event is webinar style, and members of the audience are automatically set to remain off camera. But if you have any questions or thoughts you'd like to contribute to the conversation, we invite you to participate at any time using the Q&A feature of the webinar. This virtual event is hosted from Duke University, which occupies the ancestral lands of the Shakori, Eno, and Tuscarora people. This is the keystone event of Disability Pride Week at Duke, an annual tradition celebrating disability culture and identity, hosted by Duke Disability Alliance and many collaborating student organizations. Funding and co-sponsorship for Disability Pride Week 2022 and today's guest lecture was generously provided by the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. This event is also co-sponsored by the Native American and Indigenous Student Alliance, the Duke University Undergraduate Environmental Union, and Blue Devils United. Our moderator, Marina Tsaplina, she, her, is a disability performing artist, writer, and independent scholar whose practice is rooted in anti-colonial, anti-ableist, and anti-white supremacist commitments. She is a Keenly Scholar in the Medical Humanities and an Associate of the Health Humanities Lab at Duke University. Her writing has been featured in numerous publications, including Orion Magazine and the Disability Studies Quarterly, and most recently in Sugar Bones, My Crip Ancestors, a performance and workshop about creating access to our crip lineages across disabilities, diagnosis, and biomedical names. I first met Marina in the fall of 2017 when she gave a live puppetry performance at a conference hosted by the Health Humanities Lab. The next summer, I came to observe the work she was doing with Duke pre-medical students at the Reimagine Medicine program. The gift of Marina's work is that it creates participatory spaces where we can rethink embodiment, normalcy, and the concept of wholeness. When I invited her to be our visiting artist for the Disability in the Disciplines Conference in 2019, I was so grateful for the ways she used art to build community. Over the coming year, she will be in residence at Duke University, developing Disabled Forest Guardian, a new socially engaged artistic work that centers disabled belonging amidst ecological disablement and leading an associated Story Plus and Basque Connections project. Welcome, Marina.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for your introduction and for the invitation to moderate this urgent conversation with brilliant speaker, journalist, and organizer, Jen Deerinwater. Huge congratulations as well to the Duke Disability Alliance and the opening of Duke's Disability Cultural Center. That is the power of organizing. I'm speaking to you today from the Andes Mountains, the land of the Wadi, Inca, and hundreds of indigenous groups who had spoken over 300 distinct languages prior to the Inca Empire and Spanish invasion. I feel the hauntings of my crip white skin everywhere in this region. The Sacred Valley has been and it continues to be the home of numerous indigenous peoples whose current primary economy comes from vampire tourism and the extractive mining tearing apart these mountains, melting the last glacier remaining at the peak of Wakailivka, poisoning the waters running in aquifers laid 1,000 years ago, and continuing to rupture the sacred relationship between land and people that the processes of settler colonialism and racial capitalism continue to imperil. In conversation with an Indigenous linguistic anthropologist whose employment is a tourist guide, he described the process of colonialism as a tattoo imprinted on his skin, forming his identity. Breaking apart the colonial white gaze of possession and the ableist gaze are deeply interconnected processes that we must each commit to in our times of ecocide. It is a practice of deep humility, learning, and accountability to forge solidarities and alliances built on justice and care across difficult, ongoing histories. We are incredibly lucky to have Jen Deerinwater with us to speak necessary truths and bring forward powerful visioning on the intersecting struggles that connect Indigenous, disability, and environmental justice, for they are all connected. I had the pleasure of first meeting Jen when Jen spoke on a panel I organized for the Cleveland Humanities Festival. And what I value deeply about Jen's work is her unflinching commitment to speak difficult truths. While our dominant systems are built on an ethics of evasion, Jen speaks knowingly of how the king has no clothes on and that he's a colonizer, while keeping Indigenous and crip communities central in the struggle. Jen is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues her communities face with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and a 2019 New Economies Reporting Project and 2020 Disability Futures Fellow. Jen is a contributor at Truth Out, and her work has been featured in a wide range of publications, including Rewire.news, In These Times, and Bitch Media, which unfortunately has closed. Jen's writing also appears in Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century, and the forthcoming Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements, and crip authorship, Disability as Method. Jen is the co-editor of the anthology Sacred and Subversive, and is currently hard at work on your first book. Huge congratulations. So I pass the mic to Jen. Thank you so much for being with us.
Osio, hello. It's really wonderful to be here with you all, and thank you for having me and for joining us today. We had to reschedule the original day because I had neck surgery and was having a little harder recovery than I thought I would. So welcome everyone. I'm going to start with an image description of myself. So I am a white coated, which means light skin, native femme. I'm wearing black glasses, bright purple lipstick. My hair is back and it's brown. I'm wearing dangly purple, black, and yellow native beaded earrings and a black t-shirt that you can just see the top of. It says in white bold lettering, "Demand climate justice." And behind me, you can see my office nook and into my kitchen. So 3 things that I wanted to mention right now so I don't forget. There are 3 links that are going to be dropped in the chat right now for you all. One is an article with Truth Out that I published last year in October. And it's also my article in the Indigenous issue of the Disability Studies Quarterly Journal. Those 2 articles are the research, some of the research I'll be going over today. And then there's also going to be a book out that I'll have a piece included in. It's called Property Will Cost Us the Earth, Direct Action in the Future of the Global Climate Movement. That is going to be with Verso Books. That's VERSO Books. And that link is also going to be dropped in the chat. They should be releasing the free ebook any day now. So keep an eye open for that. I know they often also have some other free ebooks, so you might want to just follow Verso in general. So I have a lot that I want to cover in a short amount of time. So I'm just going to jump right in, and I will take questions at the end. So the World Health Organization estimates that 15% of the world's population has a disability. There are 360 million Indigenous people in the world, representing 5% of the global population, comprising 5,000 distinct groups in over 90 countries. There is scarce statistical data on deaf, disabled, and ill Indigenous populations globally, but some data suggests that rates of disability in some countries are as high as 50% of the Indigenous population. 22% of the world's land surface is recognized as Indigenous land, representing 80% of the world's biodiversity. The US Department of Interior estimates there are approximately $1 trillion in potential revenues from undeveloped coal, natural gas, and oil on tribal lands. Timber is bountiful as well, as there are 18 million acres of forest land on 56 million acres of federal trust land. The potential impact to the health of Indigenous people and the world lies heavily in hands of the government and corporate entities that often steamroll over tribal sovereignty. Meanwhile, the world has reached a toxic tipping point. There has been a 50-fold increase in the production of chemicals since 1950, and this is projected to triple again by 2050. If you visit the Gulf region in Louisiana, you'll see miles and miles of chemical plants and oil and gas related infrastructure. It's known as Cancer Alley, where lives have been taken, families broken apart, and the land harmed for many, many years. So according to the WHO, 99% of the world's population breathes poor quality air. Microplastics were found for the first time in human blood. In a study done at the, and I apologize, I'm going to say this wrong, but the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, 80% of their participants in the study had plastic in their blood. All of this is a result of resource extraction, chemical manufacturing, just to name a few, which is all fueling the climate crisis. It's estimated that by 2050, at least 200 million people will be displaced by the climate crisis, 18 million of whom are disabled. The WHO estimates between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress alone. The direct damage cost to health is estimated to be between $2 to $4 billion per year by 2030. But a study by the Climate Vulnerable Forum stated that the climate crisis would add an additional 700,000 deaths per year by 2030. The final UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was released earlier this month found that at the current rate of emissions, the world will burn through its remaining carbon budget by 2030, putting the goal of keeping the world, keeping warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius impossible to reach. The same report also declared that colonialism caused the climate crisis. Those of us who are Indigenous have known this for years, but our voices have gone unheard and our direction not followed. But when I think about the devastation of the climate crisis, I think of it beyond, it's so much more than lives lost. The countries and the communities that are suffering the most immediate impacts of the climate crisis have suffered or are still suffering under colonialism. These lands and all life have been plundered to build the wealth, power, and military might of the global north. Colonized people have less resources to care for ourselves as they've all been stolen from us. In emergencies such as fires, storms, or pipeline leaks, we are often left to become more ill or die. This is also true for disabled people. Eco-Ableism, the systematic discrimination and exclusion of disabled people in climate matters, is also responsible for the situation we find ourselves in. Disabled people have often been kept out of climate negotiations and policy. We're often excluded from grassroots spaces as well. The intersectionalities of all of who we are as people, whether that be Black or brown, migrant or rural, are almost always overlooked when we are present. As I've covered and organized on the climate crisis, I'm often taken back to the crucial role that war plays, not only in the creation and worsening of this colonialistic catastrophe. I apologize. Colonialistic catastrophe, but also in how the climate crisis and mitigation efforts are furthering more war. The hypocrisy of the environmental movement and its many leaders plays a vital role in this as well. Far too many environmentalists have attacked disabled people for needing straws, or Indigenous people for hunting and fishing in our ancestral ways, blaming us for the climate crisis that we not only did not start, but we are suffering under. Meanwhile, many who are supposedly environmentalists ultimately support war, which has led to the horrendous state that we're in now. Today I want to focus on some of my latest research, looking at the intersections of climate, disability, and indigeneity, and the role the US military-industrial complex has had on our communities. I think that this is particularly timing given the situation in Ukraine, Yemen, and Palestine. I also want to speak on what I saw at COP26, which was the 26th of the UN's annual climate conference, called the Conference of the Parties. I was present for a few days, so I'd like to talk a bit about that and also talk about what we're looking at for COP27, as well as where our communities really need to focus our efforts if we're going to stop further damage and bring justice to the people most impacted. And I know this might seem a bit all over the place, but the longer that I do this work, the more I see how we're interconnected in ways that many of us have never imagined. And while he was a complicated person, to say the least, there's a Che Guevara quote that I want to invoke and ask you all to keep in mind during my talk and hopefully beyond. Above all, be sensitive in the deepest areas of yourselves to any injustice committed against whoever it may be anywhere in the world. This is the most beautiful characteristic of a revolutionary. So the Department of Defense has warned that the climate crisis will lead to greater conflicts across the world as people fight for remaining clean water and food. The US Army has reported that the Pentagon should urgently prepare for the possibility that domestic power, water, and food systems might collapse due to the climate crisis near mid-century. And we're already seeing this collapse now. Ironically, the US military is the world's largest polluter and user of dirty energy. If the US military were a country, its fuel usage alone would make it the 47th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So I want to talk about a little bit about how the US military and the military-industrial complex has kind of been built on the backs of Indigenous people and what this has meant for us in our health and the environment. So there are over 160,000 abandoned hard rock mines in the Western US, where over 6,000 Native people live. These mines include gold, silver, uranium, lead, and copper, to name a few. This number, however, of 160,000 abandoned hard rock mines does not include coal mines, which are also a type of hard rock. So of these mines, over 4,000 of them are uranium mines. It's estimated that over 286,000 Native people live near one of these abandoned uranium mines. Reservations in the Western US make up only 5.6% of the total land, but 1 in 5 uranium mines are within 10 kilometers of a reservation, with more than 75% of reservations within 80 kilometers. Very little environmental protection exists due to an old and antiquated law, which is the 1872 mining law. For example, impoundments of untreated mine waste and water are exempt from many bodies of the water that are under the Clean Water Act. Studies have directly linked exposure to the metals cadmium and arsenic to cancer mortality in Native people. The cancer mortality rates for Natives increased between 1990 to 2009, while it decreased for white people. We see similar impacts in situations in the lands known as Australia, where the world's largest uranium deposits sit on Indigenous land. In the 41 years that it was in operation, the ranger mine on traditional Mirar, that's M-I-R-A-R-R, Mirar lands had over 200 spills, leaks, and breaches. In 2013, a ranger tank linked over 1 million liters of radioactive liquid. And there are also 2 other uranium mines on this land. A recent government study found that the indigenous people near the ranger mine had a 50% higher rate of cancer versus other indigenous people in the Northern Territory of Australia. The study, however, in its infinite racism, claimed that the cancer rates weren't linked to the mine and were a result of high alcohol and tobacco consumptions. But there was limited input from indigenous people themselves, which calls into question the entire legitimacy of the study. Indigenous lands have also been used for nuclear testing and waste dumping. The Western Shoshone Nation in Nevada is considered the most bombed nation on Earth. There were 928 nuclear tests conducted between 1951 to 1992, producing nuclear fallout of around 620 kilotons. That's approximately 48 times the amount of the Hiroshima bombing in 1945. Something that I have only recently learned was about some of the nuclear waste that has occurred on my nation's reservation, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which is in northeastern Oklahoma. So it was only in 2018 that the last of 10,000 tons of radioactive waste from the site of the Sequoia Fuels plant in Gore, Oklahoma, were removed. The plant opened in 1970, where it converted yellow cake uranium into fuel for nuclear reactors. It eventually closed in 1993 due to numerous safety and environmental violations. The cleanup process was heavily spearheaded by the tribal government. As so often is the case, we had to clean up the colonizers' mess. So what I have only just learned in looking into this old plant was that when it was in operation and it was owned by the Kerr McGee Corporation, they sprayed thousands of acres of pasture land in eastern Oklahoma on my res with the fertilizer that was recycled from radioactive waste. I only learned that this week. This radioactive waste, it goes into groundwater, it contaminates the wildlife and the agriculture. It ultimately pollutes everything that anyone eats or drinks that comes from that land. So, I grew up with oil and gas, happening all over Oklahoma, but this was news to me to find out that we had radioactive waste used as fertilizer on our lands. So I want to bring us back to World War II in Hiroshima. So the Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage Facility at the Naval Base in Oahu, Hawaii, which is Pearl Harbor, on November 20th of last year, 14,000 gallons of jet fuel spilled into the water supply. According to the Navy, more than 6,000 people complained of symptoms consisting with fuel exposure, and they were seen at military health facilities, and nearly 4,000 families were displaced from their homes. The Red Hill facility has leaked fuel for decades, with both Hawaiian and federal governments to blame. Thankfully, on March 7th, the Pentagon announced they'd closed Red Hill. What the cleanup will look like and if there will be any forms of justice to Native Hawaiians and others impacted is yet to be seen. So those of us that are considered American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and I say considered because these are not our words for ourselves, but I'm giving statistical data, so I like to use the terms around that data. So we serve in the military at the highest rates per capita of any other ethnic or racial group in this country. So when I think about the US military, I think about all the ways that it's used us up, whether it was the 7th Cavalry, it's radioactive exposure and pollution, or it's the exposure to asbestos while in the Navy that led to my uncle's death from lung cancer. Our bodies are polluted and used up and murdered by the military in a variety of ways since the creation of the United States. Something else that I do talk more in detail in the Truth Out article that was shared at the beginning of the talk is that when your lands are polluted, you can't live off them traditionally. You cannot practice your ancestral ways of being. You really can't survive. This is a genocide for Indigenous people. The climate crisis is also a eugenics for disabled people. So I think that those are things that we have to all keep in mind as we talk about the climate crisis, as what this all really, all the ways that it impacts us and that it's being fueled every day. So let's get into some of what happens with the various weapons and things that are made here. So the US is the top arms dealer in the world. According to the Stockholm International Peace Institute, the US is responsible for 39% of the world's arms export globally. Truthout reported that the major US weapons manufacturers collectively spent $2.5 billion lobbying Congress over the last 20 years, with $177 million spent on lobbying last year alone. Raytheon Technologies spent the most on lobbying in 2021 at $15.3 million. About 43% of the US arms exports go to the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are the top customers. Both countries are responsible for the war in Yemen that's now in its 8th year. It's estimated 377,000 people have died in Yemen due to the war. The United Nations refers to it as the world's worst humanitarian disaster. So arms deals help the US and multinational corporations put diplomatic and capitalistic pressure on many countries, particularly those in the global South. And it can often lead to more resource extraction and environmental damage, as these countries are often forced into taking unfavorable loans that they can just never pay back. And those loans are given to them knowing that, with the idea that when there's some kind of project a multinational corporation in the US wants to go through, like building a pipeline, many times these countries will have to say yes. The organization Debt for Climate states that 100 multinationals are responsible for 71% of global emissions. And a large part of these emissions are a consequence of the exploitation of the global South. And on this topic, just something for you all to keep an eye on is the Intermonetary Fund and the World Bank are holding meetings this week and in the fall in DC. So keep an eye on that to see what happens. I know Debt for Climate is working on that, as well as a lot of other organizations. So the military budget, how do we pay for all of this? So the current defense budget is $782 billion, with numerous increases over the years, including this year and last. For context, the US currently spends more on defense than 11 countries combined, including China, Saudi Arabia, and the UK. And due to the recent Russian attacks on the Ukraine, there's been a huge growth in both the US military budget and arms dealers. On April 14th, Biden approved an additional $800 million in military aid to the Ukraine, totaling more than $3 billion. As for arms dealers, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and BAE Systems have seen their shares go up since the invasion, despite current troubles with the economy. So some of the impacts that this war is having on climate can be seen, one, with the rise of political talk on the need for energy independence. We've heard this conversation and demands for years, but it's generally referred to as independence from Middle Eastern oil. But right now, instead, it's from Russia. So Biden and other pro-extraction people they're frothing at the mouth for more US and oil gas production. And they're using this war as an excuse. And this is also coming on the heels of the Trump administration, which loosened or just did away with some of the existing environmental protections that we had, and this is coming on the heels of 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all of the oil and gas and environmental harm that went into fueling those wars. So on March 25th, Biden and the European Commission president announced a new task force that would increase liquid natural gas shipments to Europe with the excuse that it would help end European dependence on Russian oil and gas. So among the many horrendous impacts of this new task force and their agreement is that it will mean a US fracked gas surge of 50 billion cubic meters to Europe through at least 2030. According to a recent Food and Water Watch report, the value of shares held by the CEOs of 8 major fossil fuel companies has increased by nearly $100 million since the beginning of the year. Another study found high wartime prices will net the US oil and gas industry a windfall of $37 to $126 billion in 2022 alone. So we also need to keep in mind the other long-term impacts of this war. I don't want to dwell on this too much for the sake of time and also trying to stay to the talk, but the US, NATO, other Western nations are arming, training, and propping up the Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi branch of the Ukrainian military. And this has long-standing impacts on humanitarian and climate issues for years to come. So the war in Ukraine is also furthering existing food shortages for a region that's already been hard hit by environmental degradation due to years of colonialism and war and the climate crisis. For example, 80% of Lebanon's grain comes from Ukraine. And Lebanon was already in a famine before this war even began. Lebanon has also experienced ecological disasters as a result of war. In 2006, the Israeli war against Hezbollah led to a large oil spill and fire that was caused by Israeli bombing that sent an oil slick traveling up the coast of Lebanon to Syria. And this became one of, if not the worst, environmental disaster in the country, which the UN has deemed unlivable. It's deemed unlivable due to the environmental damage that's been done by US and Western nation-backed Israeli government and its genocidal campaign against Palestinians. 95% of the water in the Gaza Strip is and seawater pollution. The Israeli government also creates a lot more disabilities, as well as killing disabled people. In Jasper Puar's book, and the last name is Puar, her book, The Right to Maim, Puar found that there's an unofficial shoot to maim policy by the Israeli Defense Forces. And this is used to disable Palestinians and stop them from rising up and taking action in the future. So the IDF also, against international humanitarian law, has destroyed or damaged civilian hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and other medical facilities. They've also slowed down, stopped, or shot at civilian ambulances over the years. So the hypocrisy of this is that this war that is made the Gaza Strip completely unlivable is coming from a country that is trying to be the world's leader in solar energy. I just find that very ironic that the same country destroying an entire piece of land and killing people is also trying to be the world leader in solar energy. So I want to move on to some of the global response to some of the things I've talked about today. And I'm going to specifically use COP26 and COP27 to talk about these things. So in the book, A Clash of Climate Change Paradigms by Martin Khor, it's Khor, and Meenakshi Raman, Raman, since 2007, the COP13, which was held in Bali, there's been ongoing issues in climate negotiations that are really divided between the global north and global south. I personally don't like the terms developed, developing, underdeveloped nations, but these are the terms that get used around COP, so that's what I'm going to use now. So the developing nations tend to want a more equitable approach to the climate crisis. They want the developed nations to pay their fair share towards mitigating the global South's emissions. After all, the global North is heavily responsible for the climate crisis and wouldn't have the wealth it has if it hadn't been for the destruction of the global South and indigenous people and lands. However, the global North, which makes up the majority of the G7 countries, the G7 is the world's 7 wealthiest nations. They want agreements based more on equality, meaning that everyone has to cut their emissions in the same way by the same standards, all set by the global North, without any understanding or input from the global South on what they're actually capable of doing. The developed nations have also treated each negotiation as a whole new agreement rather than something that is built upon with each COP. They've also reinterpreted the Paris Agreement. And of course, all of this falls within the favor of the global North. So for COP26, that was held in Glasgow in November last year, COP26 was an utter failure for climate, the global South, Indigenous and disabled people, and so many more people. In terms of human rights, though, I think one of the most egregious marginalizations that I saw was the Eco-Ableism that occurred. In the final COP26 agreement, it only mentions disabled people once, one time. We are disproportionately harmed by the climate crisis, but we were mentioned only one time in the final COP26 agreement. So disabled climate activist Pauline Castres, and the last name is Castres, she said in a news article, in an interview, that this was a repeat of the Paris Agreement from 6 years ago, where there was only a brief mention in the preamble. And as she said, no clear commitments from governments to engage with disabled people, and not just disability organizations that are often ran by able-bodied people. COP26 other failure was that it focused highly on net zero emissions, which ultimately benefit climate criminals like the fossil fuel companies. Net zero emissions does not mean that you stop your emissions. It just gives you a way to buy out, saying, oh, we did X, Y, and Z damage, so we went and planted some trees and we paid money on carbon credits. Net zero emissions, it's useless. And part of the issues that we also saw in trying to get the right people to the table, the people who are being the most impacted, was that the COVID-19 vaccine apartheid really kept a lot of people from the global South, including many Indigenous people, from being able to attend COP. The costs of travel are incredibly high. The cost of hotels, Airbnbs, they all skyrocketed in Glasgow. And then you could come to the UK at that time without having a COVID vaccine, but you had to quarantine at your own expense for 2 weeks, on top of the 2 to 2.5 weeks of the COP. A lot of people just couldn't afford to do that. And so a lot of the people that should have been there weren't there. And then for the people who were able to get to Glasgow, COP26 was so disability inaccessible, many couldn't even enter it. The Israeli Energy Minister, Karine El-Harar, Elharrar, is a wheelchair user and was unable to access the conference venue. I was told they got there and they had to just turn around and leave because they couldn't get in. The organization Inclusion Scotland said that the electric shuttle buses that were used at the conference, that not all of them were wheelchair accessible, and there was a widespread failure to provide British Sign Language interpretation for most of the events. I can say there were transportation issues even getting to COP. There weren't enough cabs, there weren't enough ride shares. For those of us that couldn't just walk or take the bus, it was very difficult to get to COP. I could not get in because I would have to walk and stand so far just to get to COP, to the outer perimeter. Then you have to go through multiple security checks. It was just completely, I could not do it. I could not actually go to COP. And from some of what I heard from a friend of mine, Jason Boberg, who was at COP26, I know Jason had to go through with the conference organizers and show them all the ways in which COP26 was inaccessible. Poor signage, lack of information about the accessible entrance. I didn't even know there was an accessible entrance. I could not find this information out. It turns out, though, the accessible entrance was also the ministerial entrance, which means there was way more security there. And a lot of disabled people were being denied entrance. They were being harassed by security. Some security was demanding proof of disability before they'd let people in. It was a giant mess. Since COP26, it's basically business as usual for the world's largest polluters in the global north. Woodside Energy Limited has recently been given all the final permits for a $16.5 billion US liquefied natural gas project in offshore Western Australia. It's Australia's biggest oil and gas project in a decade. Australia is a G20 nation. The G20 is 20 wealthiest nations in the world. They're also a colonizing nation. They have a responsibility to not do things like this, yet they are. The UK has also very recently began considering lifting the fracking ban that they put in place in 2019. So I want to talk just a little bit about the COP26 coalition very quickly. So this was the more on the grounds grassroots organizing and actions. They did a lot of amazing work, but disability justice was completely absent from all of their work as well, just like it was absent from the official UN COP. There were a lot of problems with this. I'm really hoping that the grassroots organizing going forward for COP27 will include a disability justice framework and will actually have disabled people taking a lead, including disabled Indigenous people, considering how high our rates of disabilities are. So COP27, I'm running out of time. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. So COP27 is going to be held in November this year in Egypt. I have not decided yet if I'm going to go. There are a lot of safety concerns for many of us going there. The current regime is quite violent against women, queer people, press, activists, organizers. I'll spare you the details, but they've done some pretty horrible things over the last few years. And one of the concerns some of us are having is not just for those of us coming from outside Egypt, but also for the well-being of Egyptians. Will their civil and human rights be respected so that they can protest? And the response from Dr. Yasmin Fouad, F-O-U-A-D, she's the Egypt's Minister of Environment. Her response on this was very concerning as she towed the party line and denied any and all human rights violations, even though we know there are many occurring now, and said that they would work with UN on any protest situations. And people in Egypt have plenty to protest about. The environmental pollution is more than threefold in Cairo. The World Health Organization says 2 out of 1,000 or nearly 1 million people will develop health issues as a result of the air pollution. 95% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile, which is highly polluted. There are more than 350 factories dumping pollution into the river. There are food scarcity issues. Rising seawater is going into the water aquifer in the Nile Delta and it's killing crops. It's estimated that 10% of the land could be ruined in the next 10 years. So there are plenty of reasons for Egyptians to want to come out and protest and organize for COP27, but if that will happen is to remain to be seen, and what that'll look like. And even if people are able to safely protest during COP27, one of my questions will be, what happens to Egyptians when the rest of us go home? I also question whether or not Egypt can really do much and hold the UN and all of its member nations accountable. Egypt, for example, China invests heavily in their country, and the US sells a lot of arms to Egypt. So are they going to really be all that invested in stopping the climate crisis at all costs? I doubt it. And the climate crisis is also causing war, as I mentioned earlier. Only 3% of Egypt is inhabitable due to the lack of water. And 60% of the Nile originates in Ethiopia. And there are currently escalating tensions between these countries and the Sudan regarding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Ethiopia and Sudan say that, Egypt and the Sudan say that Ethiopia is withholding water from them. And as our food scarcity, water scarcity, all of these things get worse in the years to come, we will be seeing more war, which obviously, like I've pointed out, war fuels the climate crisis. So what are some next steps that we can take? The tendrils of these many issues and communities are also interrelated. As I've attempted to show you today, there's so much more that I couldn't possibly talk about as well. Colonialism, it brings war, which is fueled by the environmental destruction, which creates and worsens illnesses and disabilities, often in indigenous people. Meanwhile, many in the environmental movements believe the very same system that's killing us will save us, that the same organizing tactics, which often exclude indigenous and disabled people and many other marginalized people, they think these tactics will save us, but they won't. The system is stacked against us, and more so with every day. And the system isn't broken. It's working entirely as it is intended. If I am able, through my own research, to sit over here and put all these things together and figure out that the government knows what it's doing and these things are happening, you cannot say that the people in the UN or the US government don't know what they're doing. They know, they just don't care. So some of the things that I think we need to be working on, rather than attempting to work within, reform, or save the system, we need to just avoid all of that. We need to use our ancestral knowledge, survival skills, and the beauty of our crip and indigenous people. The direction of Black and Brown people, migrants, campesinos, women, queer people, and so many more must be taken. More importantly, we must stop relying on the same ways of being that still replicate systems of harm within our climate movement. And, simply being present for those of us who are more marginalized, that's never going to be enough. Visibility will never be enough. Education will never be enough. They are important, but they're not enough on their own. In the days of us allowing those with the most power to run our movements and speak for us or bully our communities into compliance, that's over. We have to move past that. And we have to be loud, we have to be bold, and we have to take over these spaces. Otherwise, our needs will never be heard and they will never be met. I think we also need to look to our losses. After 20 years of community organizing work, I've learned that it's in our losses and mistakes that we can often learn the most. And as I've pointed out here, we have to stop using the same liberal tactics, letter writing, making phone calls, those things. They don't do anything. They don't stop the problems that have led us off the cliff. Nothing less than direct action is going to save us. It is going to take people locking themselves to construction machinery, the doors of banks, and so much more to stop this. Now, I would feel remiss if I did not say that there is a role for everyone to play. You don't necessarily have to be locking yourself down to equipment or buildings and things. There are other ways to play a role in direct action. And there are many roles that can be played across different types of disabilities. And those roles, the roles that we take, they can vary and change with time. And every single role is valuable. Because I've been going through a lot of surgeries the last couple of years, I've not been able to go out and do as much like frontline direct news coverage as I'd like to do, but I'm still keeping at it. I may not be out in those streets or out in those mountains or whatever, but I'm at home, compiling data. I'm doing interviews. I'm analyzing all of this, and I'm trying to share it with people so that they know what's going on. Because these are things that mainstream media and the government, they're not going to share this stuff with you because they're invested in these systems that are harming us. And I say all of this today in the hopes to not overwhelm you, because I know many of us are overwhelmed. Climate anxiety is real. I say these things to motivate you all in the hopes that you will be a driving force for change and for justice in this world. Especially for our youth. You all have inherited a mess, and for that I am very sorry, but I'm going to be here as long as I can to help fight with you all. And I think that all of us need to be fighting together, and we need to remember the intersectionality of all of this work that we're doing. So I want to stop there, and I want to say Wado, thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions right now.
Whew. Maybe we could all take an exhale, huh? You have given us so much to sit, work, think through for a long time. And I hope this is the beginning of a deeper ongoing conversation, both at Duke and much beyond, on the intersections between colonialism, ableism, and ecological crisis. Because I think once we perceive it, you can't unperceive it. Like there's no going back, right? It shifts everything. And so I'm also struck by, you had this, what you might call a litany of undeniable evidence, right? Like undeniable statistical data of the impacts of colonialism and these systems onto the ecological crisis. And at the same time, how this loss is immeasurable, right? It's so much greater than what these statistics can account for. And so, you invoke the Che Guevara quote, which is to be sensitive, and to be sensitive as to the deep harms and not being the core of our resistance. Right. And it's very difficult to stay sensitive, but it also has to be learned. Right. We have to learn to perceive how the logics of colonialism are embedded into all of our systems, whether that's education, medicine, the legal system, property law, and beyond, and including our own imaginations. Right. So my first questions, and there's other questions in the chat, which I'll bring forth, but I'll get us started. And please, if there are other questions, add them to the Q&A, or you could raise your hand and maybe we can bring you on, I'm not sure. But could you speak more to the concept and impacts of eco-ableism that you introduced? So how is eco-ableism connected to eugenics, connected to land dispossession, and the colonial basis of environmental conservation?
So the eco-ableism, ableism ties into racism and sexism and all of these things in a variety of ways, and we see this in the climate movement. So eco-ableism, it is basically denying the needs of disabled, deaf, ill, neurodivergent people. It's keeping us from being at the table. It's keeping us from being a part of, negotiations, policy talk. It's part of what keeps us out of grassroots spaces. And by doing this, that means that the harm that we're doing to the environment and that we're doing to our bodies, I apologize. I feel like I'm struggling to get my words together today. But, you know, as it's harming our bodies and harming our land, it really does, it ties into the history of colonialism and eugenics. It is a way of killing off the people that the colonizer doesn't want around. You know, there are many ways in which Native people or disabled people suffer genocide and eugenics, and it's not necessarily someone coming in and outright killing you. Sometimes it's a slow death. And climate, environmental destruction and the climate crisis is a process of death for many of us. Some of us are just getting there faster. And eco-ableism definitely plays into that. I hope I answered that question. Yeah, some of this stuff, some of this research that I gave you all today, like around uranium and nuclear testing and bombs and things, that's a new area of research for me. So I am learning this stuff as I am going along. You know, I'm an expert on my own life. I think we're all experts on our own lives, but by no means can one person ever know everything. And you should be very wary of anyone who thinks that they know everything and have all the answers.
Absolutely. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. So this one is from, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Timotheus Gordon Jr. Are there current examples of reparations for disabled people and other marginalized people given by federal or local entity as a way to apologize for harming cultural lands and neighborhoods and environments? If not, what do you think those reparations would look like for those impacted by harmful effects of federal entities like the military? Good question.
To the best of my knowledge, no. There have been lawsuits here and there over the years, and, you know, tribal nations or individuals have been awarded money as a result, but has there been any real reparations? No. I would love to see that happen, but I don't foresee the US doing that. I don't foresee any of our governments within this country ever admitting to the wrongdoing it's done, let alone trying to follow a path towards justice. For me, a lot of that's going to go to tribal sovereignty. The US government needs to get its foot off the neck of tribes. We need to actually let tribal governments be in control of the land. We need to let local communities make decisions for themselves. And this kind of does feed a bit into the second question that was there, asking for more specific information around strategies for advocacy. And my answer is going to be, it's going to depend. I cannot give you one set answer. I wish that I could, but I can't, because every community is different. Every place is going to have a different need. And as a result, there will be different strategies required for changing things. I think Indigenous people should be the ones taking the lead on that. Black and brown people, disabled people, women, queer folks, everyone who's being disproportionately impacted should be taking the lead in the decisions on what happens in their communities. But like I said, what that looks like is going to look different for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, especially for all of us who live with disability, chronic illness, you know, like just realizing that there's multiple ways of participating, and it doesn't mean that we are chaining ourselves. It doesn't mean that we are necessarily quote unquote putting our bodies on the line, because really our bodies are already on the line, right? And I think to how I think to Joanna Hedva's kind of invocation, she's another disabled woman, and she says how, you know, what if the revolution looks like us dropping our arms from exhaustion because we are so tired of this moment, right? And I think that's really powerful, and it also calls for potentially a different engagement with time. Crip time, like how, so here's a question, kind of, how do you feel that crip time could be mobilized? Which is maybe it's a funny question, but there's different rhythms and times, right? There's like the urgency of the crisis, but then there's the deep relational work, right, that happens on a different scale. And Indigenous scholar Kyle White articulated that really beautifully, that the ecological tipping point was crossed much after the relational tipping point was crossed, right, by settler colonialism and these forces. So what do you see that happening? Have you had examples of like effective mobilization strategies, across disabled and Indigenous communities that take different forms and different shapes? And yeah, we'd love to hear that. I think there's a couple of questions about like organizing strategies.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to give you some just concrete examples of things. And once again, bearing in mind, each community needs to make decisions for themselves on how to best go about things. But like I did back in 2017, I did a hard lockdown in the middle of a street in DC. And we were protesting the Wells Fargo float in the DC Pride Parade, as well as weapons manufacturers, the police, all kinds of things. And so some of the things that we did to try to make it more accessible, like for me, for example, because we're sitting down on a street, my arm is locked into a PVC pipe and my one free hand is, with a bullhorn. We put a cushion underneath me. There were people there to put like boxes and things underneath people's arms who were in the PVC pipes. There are always things that can be done to make stuff accessible. Something I saw actually at the Global Day of Climate Action March that was in Glasgow for COP26 that I really liked was one of our members of the Native community who is disabled was in a pedicab. They did the whole march in a pedicab. I loved that. There are ways to make this stuff accessible for different people. And disability access is broad. That is going to look different for everyone. What I need is not going to be the same as someone else. But there are strategies and things that we can do to make these things more accessible for people, whether that is making sure there's seating, making sure there's sign language, having pedicabs at marches. There are so many different things that we can do to make this stuff accessible and to include all of our communities.
And that's really beautiful. And of course, is the core of disability justice is the care work, right? And keeping, like, if we do not all move together, none of us move together, right?
Yeah, I should also add too, because this is something that I'm trying to talk more about, especially with youth doing direct action work and this community organizing work, is that you have to take time for yourself. You have to rest. And this is where I think crip time and Indigenous time and stuff comes in, is that yes, there is a dire emergency, but this is a marathon, not a sprint. You have to take care of yourselves and you have to take care of each other. In doing that, if we are going to build movements that stop the climate crisis, that stop all of these different issues I've talked about and so much more, that is going to take us building a community in which we care for one another and that we value one another. If someone gets sick, we don't just say, oh, well, I'll see you whenever you can come back to organizing work. No, we step up and we say, what do you need and what can we do? If someone has a child and they need some childcare, we step up, we do that. Whatever it is, like, we cannot be effective movements if we are not caring for one another, because the system is not going to care for us. And we're not meant to live these very individualistic lives the way we have been forced to do under colonialism and capitalism. We are meant to be in communities. So part of this movement work, part of any movement work, has got to also include local communities building communities for themselves, deciding what they want that community to look like, and in the process supporting and loving one another.
Amazing, amazing answer. And so rooted and true. So there's a question here from Scarlett, and I apologize, there's a bit of noise happening. I don't know if that's coming through. So Scarlett, who's a citizen of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, and who's also president of the Duke Native American Indigenous Student Alliance. And this is really a question about white people doing the work and not bringing it to Native folks. But I'll read Scarlett's question. What advice do you have for allies who wish to support disabled and/or Indigenous movements groups on campus? In my experience, many people reach out to us asking how to show their support or asking us to educate them. While we appreciate the thought, this often leads to more work and energy on our end, which is already limited. On the other hand, when people move forward without consulting us, they often take actions or use language that they assume is helpful, but oftentimes isn't, because of the fact that non-Native peoples are typically not educated on how nuanced the issues and experiences of Native and/or disabled people are. Yeah, so some just your thoughts on that, specifically on campus organizing. I think it moves beyond that.
I want to start by saying it's been a long time since I've been on a campus organizing. The strategies that you all have to take now could be entirely different than what I was doing 20 years ago when I was an undergrad. But you're right. There are always people coming to me as well. What do I do? How do I support? And it's like, well, one, stop asking me to give free labor. I'm tired. I'm busy. I'm in a lot of pain. I'm going through multiple surgeries. I don't have time to educate every single individual who asks me that. So I'll be honest. I just flat out tell people, you want to learn about us? Go read our work. Go watch our talks, watch our movies. Pay us to come do talks. Don't just come to us asking for free labor over and over again. Google exists if you have internet access. And I do realize there is a very deep digital divide in this country and in much of the world. But if you can send a message on Instagram, you can go Google and look up books or movies or something to learn about a topic, whether it's related to disability or it's related to indigeneity. So that's one thing. I would just, know the worth and value of your time and learn where to put your time and energy. There are always going to be people that are going to come along and say, but we're allies, but they're not really there for you. They're there to sort of mitigate their own guilt in whatever privilege it is that they have. So know the value of your time and respect that time. Oh man, there was something else I was going to say and it just slipped my mind. I looked at the time and went, we're almost done. There was more I was going to say, and I would love to connect with you. I apologize. I cannot remember my Eastern Band relative's name right now. But
Scarlett.
Yeah, Scarlett, but please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you all as much as I can. It may take me a while to get back to you, but I'm here and I'm happy to connect. With Native students, disabled students, whomever. I'm here to try to help however I can. Yes.
So we're really coming up right to the edge of our time together with you. And maybe just the last closing question is, what keeps you rooted in the work? What keeps you rooted in your commitment? What keeps you grounded? Because this is heavy, right? And sensitivity is not free, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to be very, very honest. I don't believe in toxic positivity. I'm not going to pretend like every day is great. Some days are really hard. Some days I'm just like, I can't do it. I'm in too much pain. I don't have any hope left in me. All I want to do is lay in bed and cry. and I'm getting better about learning to listen to myself and do those things. If I just need to stay in bed and cry, I try to give myself more of that space. I don't really feel a great amount of hope in the world, given the way things are and the direction that they've been going throughout my life. So some days it's not hope that keeps me going. It is spite, pure spite, because I told myself I wasn't going to cuss, but I don't know how to say this without cussing, but fuck them. Fuck the government, fuck all these leaders, fossil fuel companies, all of them. That's a part of what keeps me going, just plain spite some days. But on a happier note, there are also the people that I see doing all of this amazing work. You know, all of you here that organize this event and the work you do in your own lives, you know, the work I see my friends and other community members doing, you know, there are amazing people in this world stepping up who are already struggling so much in their daily lives, and they're out there fighting the good fight, whatever that fight is. And that also keeps me going, is seeing that I'm not alone in this. Like sometimes I do feel very, very alone, but I'm not alone in this. There are other people out there doing work that are amazing. So I guess spite and the good people that exist.
Because anger is a right, we need to have space for rightful anger.
Yeah.
I've heard it referred to as sacred rage, which is a really powerful force and necessary, right? And taking the time. I am afraid we are at the end. I do want to just say that there's definitely somebody in the chat who said, I'm spiteful too from the disability side. So yeah, for sure. So yeah, if you pass it on to Marianne, but Jen, this has been terrific.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jen, for your amazing lecture. Thank you, Marina, for moderating. I want to also thank our interpreters, Cheryl and Elaine, and our captioners. If anyone who participated in today's event is interested in seeing future events from Duke Disability Alliance, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And we do plan to make this recording available on our YouTube channel. So thank you all so much for participating, and I hope to see you all again soon.